So today we're going to be doing our third session on the story of Scripture. And last time we got up to the book of Judges. So now we're going to pick up with 1 Samuel and go through the book of Nehemiah. Okay, so if we look at those books, that's 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings, 1st and 2nd Chronicles, Ezra, and Nehemiah. So that's the books we're going to do. We're doing 8 books. Counting is hard. And if we look at those books, we can think of those books as historical books. In fact, that's the way some Bible surveys will describe it, as these are the historical books. And we can sometimes include Joshua Judges in that, and sometimes we'll include even Deuteronomy in that in some Bible surveys. But I bracketed off, like I said last time. So last time we talked about Exodus through the book of Judges, and I said that that's one complete arc, the arc of the Promised Land, entering, coming from Egypt through the wilderness and into the Promised Land, and that sort of ends with Joshua Judges. Right? With 1 Samuel through Ezra and Nehemiah, we have the occupancy or the time that Israel is in the Promised Land, and then their exile and their return. Right. So 1 Samuel and 2 Samuel is focuses mainly on the monarchy of Saul and the monarchy of David. Right. So our first 2 kings, and then the 2 books of Kings pick up with Solomon and go through the exile. And Chronicles basically is parallel to that. So in many ways, Chronicles is a retelling of what we see in Samuel and Kings. The Chronicles start off with a few genealogies, which are picked up from Genesis and from Exodus and places like that. But by about chapter 9 of 1 Chronicles, we basically just restart the book of Samuel. So if you read your Bible through from Genesis to Revelation, you read all this, Samuel and Kings, and it's all this, exciting stories. Then you have this pause with the genealogies, and then you start back again. And a lot of times people are like, haven't I already read this? Yes, you have. What's very important, however, about these books is that Samuel, Kings, and Chronicles are telling the same history from different perspectives. Okay, so in our last session, we talked about Exodus through Judges, and that we have sort of multiple perspectives about the covenant and about the Promised Land and about God's relationship with Israel. And again, so that's, you can think of that in Exodus through Judges, that's mainly, you can think of like the book of Leviticus and the book of Deuteronomy, right? So we have 2 types of law from 2 different perspectives. Leviticus sort of from the tabernacle and temple priestly perspective, and Deuteronomy, which is more usually associated with the monarchy or the civil government of Israel. And the same thing happens in Samuel, Kings, and Chronicles. Samuel, Kings is the Deuteronomy version, if you want to go with that. Sometimes it's called the Deuteronomistic history. And Chronicles is more of the priestly history. Okay, so again, you're telling the same events, right? So think of it like world history or American history, right? You have to hit all the big people, right? We have to talk about George Washington. We got to talk about Abraham Lincoln. We got to talk about World War I, right? It's the same big events, but we're going to tell it from sort of 2 different vantage points, right? The details or the way they present things is a little bit different, okay? So again, not to go too deep into it, but to give you an idea or a flavor of that. So in the Deuteronomistic history of Samuel, Kings, we have this ongoing formula of such and such a king dies and his son comes to the throne, and then we sort of talk about the son, right? So this is his name, this is his mother's name, he reigned for this many, he came to the throne in this year, and he reigned for this many years, and then usually we have a description of how that king was. Is he a good king or is he a bad king? Spoiler alert, they're all bad kings. There's only about 3 of the kings, that would be David, Josiah, and then possibly Uzziah, are considered good kings in the book of, in the book of Samuel. And everybody else is really bad, particularly the kingdoms of the north, right? So if we go sort of 2 sessions ago and we talked about Genesis, there are 2 major tribes. So there's 12 total tribes, but there are 2 main tribes that are leaders, right? There's the tribe of Judah, which sort of governs the southern tribes, and then the tribe of Ephraim. And Ephraim is one of the sons of Joseph, right? So again, at the end of Genesis, if you go back to that first session we did, at the end of Genesis, there's this sort of ongoing tension between Judah or Joseph, which one of one of them is going to be the patriarch, the leader of Israel after Jacob? And the answer is yes, they both are, and that leads us or prepares us to understand the Book of Kings, because after Solomon, the northern 10 tribes go with Ephraim, and they form a kingdom called Israel. And then the southern 2 tribes, which is basically Judah and Benjamin, and then some hangers-on, formed their own kingdom, and they called themselves Judah after the main tribe. And if you were an Israelite king in the north, you're always bad. There's no good kings up there. In the south, there's only 3 good kings: David, Josiah, and maybe Uzziah. And there's some discussion about whether that there are some kings that look kind of good. Are they really good? And so there's some ongoing discussion about that. Okay, so in Chronicles, same history. We're going to start with Saul and David. We're going to go to the exile. Okay, but we're going to tell the history a little bit differently. And so the Chronicles history is more from the priestly perspective. It picks up a lot of the events from Samuel Kings. In fact, many scholars think that basically the person who wrote Chronicles had the books of I'm going to keep messing up all these S names, Samuel and Kings, and then is basically just, tweaking and adjusting it a little bit. So in comparison between the 2 things, Chronicles focuses a little bit more on priestly things. So we have more stories about the temple. So in 1 Kings, we see the description in which Solomon builds the temple, but we don't really get a lot of details. In Chronicles, they go into all the details. They tell you the size of all the bowls and everything, right? And Chronicles, we also get some additional stories. So what's interesting is, if you remember, I said in the book of Kings, there are only 3 good kings. But in Chronicles, some of those bad kings we sort of add a story in there that makes them look a little bit better. And some of the good kings, like Josiah, we add stories into them that make them look worse, right? So we kind of bring everyone back to the same level. We're all kind of gray, right? We're not really super good. We're not super bad. We get some additional stories that kind of color the narrative and give us a different perspective, right? So it's if you kind of think about it like American history, right? So you get sort of like George Washington and a traditional history, and then in this history you might get, like the chopping down of the cherry tree, or that he, whatever. You might get some additional stories that bring a different perspective to how to think about the books. Okay? So at the end of Chronicles, we get an additional portion of history that we don't have in Kings. All right? And that's important because that's going to talk about how the exile works, basically. So again, we can think about Chronicles as a later book, right? It's written after Samuel Kings. It knows about Samuel Kings. It's going to adapt and modify Samuel Kings. So it adds more history to it, right? So 2 Kings ends with the destruction of Jerusalem, and with that's sort of the end, right? The curtain falls, Jerusalem has been destroyed, end of story, we're going into the exile. In Chronicles, we have about an additional chapter, maybe a chapter and a half, in which we're going to talk about what happens to the king's family and some of the elders and the leaders of Israel who've gone into the exile, right? So we're going to find out about one of those last kings. He's going to be taken off by Babylon into captivity, and he spends a period of time in prison. And then he gets elevated to sit at the king's table in Babylon as one of his advisors. And we didn't know about that at the end of Second Kings. All right, so we get like a little bit more history. Now, that's important when we get into Ezra and Nehemiah. So Ezra and Nehemiah is, you sort of like pause, jump about 70 years, and then we restart the history again, right? So there's this gap of the exile that occurs from the way the Bible describes it, right? So starting in Genesis, we had everything basically recorded from creation all the way down through all of these families. We get into Samuel, Kings, into Chronicles, and we get to the exile, and then it stops. We don't really know what happens during the exile. But we know that about 2 generations pass there, and we know that from other books, the prophetic books like Daniel and Jeremiah and Malachi. We'll talk about those next time a little bit more. They sort of tell us that about 70 years of history has passed, and it's just not recorded for us. And so Ezra and Nehemiah picks up at the end of the exile when the people are returning, right? So again, Jeremiah receives the prophecy from God that 2 generations, the children and the grandchildren of the exiles are going to live in Babylonia, and then only the grandchildren and their children might be able to come back. And so that's where Ezra and Nehemiah picks up. It picks up on the beginning of these returns back to the Promised Land. Now, when they went into exile in sort of 3 waves, right? First, we have the Assyrian exile, which takes the northern kingdom away. And then we have what's called the first Babylonian exile, which takes most of the leadership away. And that's the one that's going to correspond to Daniel. So when you look at the book of Daniel, it says that Daniel and his 3 friends were taken to exile into the court of the Babylonian king. That occurs in what's called the first Babylonian exile. And then a few years later, we have the second Babylonian exile. Now, it's the same period of time. It's just some people went a few years earlier than other people did, right? So we had one wave of exiles, and then about, I think it's like 5 years, we have the rest of everyone in Jerusalem comes away. Now, saying that in terms of history, not every single individual in Jerusalem went into the exile. When we think of the Bible's perspective, it is focused on the people that are writing the Bible, right? So when it says that these people are going to exile, they're mainly focused on the priest going to exile, the king, his family, and the extended Davidic, dynasties are going to exile. Political leaders are going to exile, and probably wealthy people. Peasants, farmers, the people who lived in the villages around Jerusalem, they stayed in the land, okay? Now, let me jump back to Ezra and Nehemiah. So the same thing is going to happen with Ezra and Nehemiah. We're going to have 3 waves come back. We have 3 waves go to Babylonia. We have 3 waves come back from Babylonia in Ezra and Nehemiah. The first wave comes back, and they first build the city, right? So they're going to first rebuild the city. And then they're going to the second wave, which is under a different guy, is going to come back, and they're going to start restoring the tabernacle or the temple. They're going to start having sacrifices on the Temple Mount again. And then the third wave, this is the wave that comes back with Nehemiah, and he's the one that builds the wall around Jerusalem, right? So you had people who were, Jerusalem basically during the 70 years is relatively unoccupied. There probably still were people living there, but it was essentially not a functioning city. The first wave of returnees come back, they start making it a city. The second wave of people come back, probably priests. This is probably when Ezra comes back, and they're going to restore the temple service, the sacrifices, and the worship there. And they're basically going to start building a very small temple on the site. And then the third wave comes back. This is the wave associated with Nehemiah in the book of Nehemiah. And he's going to bring back some more people, and then they're going to rebuild the wall and basically establish Jerusalem again as a functioning city, a city where God is worshipped again, and a city that sort of is again forming the regional capital. Now, in that, just like there were people who never went into the exile historically, there are people who never came back from the exile historically, right? So now you have all of these people sort of scattered throughout the Middle East, right? You have the peasants who were always there. You have these, priestly and Davidic families who went out and came back. And then some of them stayed in Babylonia. Some of them came back to Babylonia. With regards to the northern kingdoms, they essentially never come back. In many ways, we really don't know what happened to them in Assyria. Probably, from what we see from records of what the Assyrians did with other peoples, those people were scattered across the entire Assyrian Empire and basically were forcibly intermarried with each other so that they would basically just disappear historically, right? You had to lose your name, you were forced to kind of move to a new village and assimilate, and they basically just kind of disappear. In the Babylonian exile, it's very different. They went off, they settled a very particular place of land in Babylonia, and then they all came back. Okay? And so in Ezra and Nehemiah, we're seeing these returns. And again, here we see something very interesting, in my opinion. Just like we had Leviticus and Deuteronomy, and then the Samuel Kings and Chronicles, we have the sort of two versions. When we get to Ezra and Nehemiah, we only get one side of the discussion we've been having thus far. We don't really have anything in Ezra and Nehemiah or in the later prophetic books that represents that Deuteronomy or Deuteronomistic perspective. That perspective basically gets completely erased when we come back from the exile. The priestly thinkers or the priestly perspective is what basically dominates Ezra and Nehemiah. And that becomes a very important point when we look at Ezra and Nehemiah. Ezra has a lot of discussion of reading the Torah and people weeping openly because they're hearing the words of God to them again. In Nehemiah, there's this very long discussion of who's really Judean or an Israelite, and who's pure and who has been mixed with, again, that's assimilation thing, who is mixed with other peoples and they're not really part of us anymore. And there's this discussion of who's in and who's out. That's a priestly perspective. And so this Ezra and Nehemiah basically marks a transition in the way the Bible approaches history or approaches how God works. After the exile, only the priests seem to return. We may have people who were Davidic heirs come back. We know that from Chronicles. We know that from the New Testament in the life of Jesus. But basically, the monarchy that we had before is never restored. And that was the point, right? The Babylonians and the Persians and the Greeks and the Romans after them did not really want the Israelites, the nation of Judah or Israel, to form their own independent country. And it basically, from the perspective of the Bible, never occurs. Historically, there is a period between what we call the Old Testament and the New Testament that in which there is a Jewish kingdom, but it's not a Jewish kingdom that's after from the tribe of David, right? So the David's descendants never become the kings ever again. Once they're taken off the throne in the exile, they never return. The priests, however, come back, they restore their power, and they basically function into the time of the New Testament as the power base of what Israel is. And that really is why we don't see that Deuteronomistic monarchy-focused perspective after the exile. Okay? Now, we're going to pick up next time with the poetic and the prophetic books. So the rest of the Old Testament, starting about the book of Job, go through Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, Song of Solomon. We're going to do Isaiah and Jeremiah and all the other prophets. That's what we're going to do next week in a big chunk. And that's because that is its own thing, right? We've had history, and now we have to do not sort of the parallel to history, the things, the poetry and the prophecy. Okay? So with that,